welcome to KRAD COVID Readings. I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido, doing my bit to cure the coronavirus blues with Trek Tuesday, where I read an installment from one of my Star Trek Starfleet Corps of Engineers stories. We now continue with part 2 of Fatal Error, which was the second book in the Corps of Engineers series, which was created by myself and John J. Ordover back in 2000. We started with The Belly of the Beast by Dean Wesley Smith, which introduced the ship and crew, and also killed one of them, 111, who is a part of a bonded Binar pair. And the remaining member, 110, of the Binar pair is figuring out what to do with his life now. So, anyway, let's pick things up with Chapter 3 of Fatal Error. Sonia Gomez entered the briefing room at 0750, figuring Kieran Duffy wouldn't have arrived yet. In this, she was correct. In fact, the room was empty when she entered, and so she went to the replicator with a clear conscience. Computer, hot Earl Grey tea, please. That's not a hot chocolate, is it? Came Kieran's voice from behind her. Sonia tried very hard not to yell. She also resisted the urge to dump the contents of the now materializing mug all over the second officer. Kieran had a huge smile on his face as he approached her from the still open entrance. 'Cause you know what happens when you order hot chocolate. 10 years, Kieran. It's been 10 years since I spilled hot chocolate on Captain Picard. And yet the joke remains funny. To you, maybe, she said, dolefully sipping her tea. All right, I'm sorry, Kieran said, hitting her with those puppy dog eyes that she'd never been able to resist. Forgive me? Rolling her eyes, Sonia went to sit at the table. What am I going to do with you? Well, I have some creative suggestions, Kieran said as he sat down next to her. Sonia noted that he had a pad in his hand. The doors parted to allow Geordi and P8 Blue in, which came to Sonia as something of a relief. The conversation with Kieran was starting to get a little too comfortable for her. Geordi was in the midst of a laugh, which didn't surprise Sonia. Patty had a nasty sense of humor, and Geordi was probably the only person on the Da Vinci who hadn't heard all of her jokes yet. Sonia had hoped that the S.C.E.'s next test wouldn't come until after they had stopped off at the starbase for a number of reasons, one of which was that Geordi LaForge wouldn't be on board anymore. She liked and admired Geordi, and she was certainly of great use on their last mission, but she felt so damned awkward around him. After all, he had been her first CO out of the academy, and now she outranked him. It didn't seem right somehow. Geordi himself wasn't making a big deal out of it, but Sonia always felt like she was walking on eggshells around him. Patty had walked in on her hind legs, as Nassats generally did when they walked alongside other humanoids, since even at full height they were shorter than most. However, once she came into the room, she skittered on all six to her specially designed seat at one end of the table. Duffy, Gomez? Geordi said as he went in to sit down, nodding to each of them. Hey, that's not hot chocolate, is it? Sonia banged her head against the table. Geordi, of course, had been present for the infamous hot chocolate incident. No, she said through clenched teeth, it isn't. Good, because you know what happened when I order hot chocolate. Yes, I know. See? Kieran said. I told you it was still funny. Geordi peered at the mug. That's Earl Grey, isn't it? Sonia nodded as she took a sip. That was Sonia's way of making penance, Kieran explained, even though Sonia really didn't need him to. She avoided hot chocolate like the plague and started drinking the captain's favorite drink. Now I'm addicted to it, Sonia said ruefully. Patty made the tinkling sound that passed for a chuckle among Nassats. The price we pay for the follies of our youth. Glaring at Kieran, Sonia said, some of us pay more than others. Within minutes, the rest of the S.C.E. crew arrived, as did Captain Gold. They all took their seats around the table. Sonia couldn't help but notice the empty chair next to 110. That was the other reason why she had wanted to stop off at Starbase 505 before they got their next assignment. 110 was supposed to go home to Binus, and, if Sonia had her Binar customs right, rebond with another. Indeed, Sonia hadn't been entirely sure that 110 was going to even attend the meeting, though she was glad he did. He was still part of the team, after all. The captain said, all right, boys and girls, and Nassat and Binar, here's the story. We're heading to a planet called Eerlik. The planet is entirely run by a computer called Ganitriul. It's broken, and we get to fix it. They named the computer, said Fabian Stevens, sounding surprised. It's got a personality, might even be sentient. Carol Abramowitz shook her head. And they can't fix it. Why, exactly? Turning to Kieran, the captain said, Duffy? Kieran nodded, touched his pad, and an image appeared on the screen. Sonia looked up to see an image she recognized from the mission profile she'd studied before the meeting, an Eerlika. As a rule, these teal-skinned people were short, hairless, with almost stubby arms and legs, and very wide eyes. Eerlik is a thriving, vibrant planet, Kieran said, that is technologically quite advanced, at least in some ways. They only recently started venturing into space. The Eerlik's focus has been more in the direction of technology for comfort. They've gotten very little by way of an urge to explore. They developed space travel several thousand years ago, but never bothered with it much beyond going to the moon and back. About 50 years ago, a sect went out and colonized the 9th planet in their system. How come? Carol asked. Trust the cultural specialist to zero in on that, Sonia thought with a smile. Kieran's eyes went wide. Not sure. Hang on. And trust the engineer not to have a clue, Sonia thought with a wider smile. Luckily, she had read the entire thing, unlike her second officer. A group of Eerlik that called themselves the Pevni broke off from the mainstream religion. They wanted to start over in a new place. Carol nodded. Right, Kieran said. Sonia noticed several people trying and failing to hide smiles. Anyhow, the Federation made contact shortly after the colony was established. They weren't interested in joining, but Eerlik has a rich supply of uridium, so a bunch of trade agreements were made. Kieran touched his pad again, and an image of the Eerlik's moon appeared. For the last 3,000 years or so, Eerlik has been completely run, maintained, and administered by Ganitriul, which is a giant computer located on its moon. As he spoke, the display slowly changed to a schematic that showed how the moon had been excavated and Ganitriul installed. Everything on Eerlik is run by Ganitriul, and it hasn't failed them once. It has some of the best diagnostic software and auto repair components that anyone's ever seen. He looked at 110. Might even put the master computer on Binus to shame. That is unlikely, 110 said simply. Kieran grinned up for a moment and then got serious again as he went on. Like I said, Ganitriul hasn't failed them until now. Nothing is working right on the planet anymore. Climate controls, entertainment, communications, food distribution, planetary defense, everything. It's complete and total chaos. Bart Falwell shook his head. That doesn't really answer the question. What do they need us for? Surely they can fix their own computer. Fabian smiled. Not if they can't get to it. Commander, you said that Ganitriul, Kieran completed. Right. That it runs everything? That includes transporters and ships, right? Nodding, Kieran said. That's it exactly. And also communications. The only reason we know there's a problem at all is because Ganitriul itself contacted the Federation Council asking for help. Eerlik is cut off from any useful communication, and from what Ganitriul said in its message, none of their modes of travel are functioning. So it's up to us, Patty said. Why should today be different from any other day? Captain Gold said with a smile. He looked at Sonia. Commander? I think we can keep this down to a 2-person team, plus, she added with a look at Domenica Corsi, a security detail. The security chief nodded, her blonde head. Kieran fixed her with a look, but said nothing. Patty and Carol were less reticent. Only 2? The Nassad asked, at the same time that Carol said, We're talking about the collapse of a culture here. Patiently, Sonia said, The results of the problem are large, but the problem itself is pretty straightforward. Fix the computer. If we send a big team down there to do, in essence, one thing, we'll be stepping all over each other. 2 of us should be able to handle it just fine. If we need more, we'll call. Who'll be on the team? The captain said before anyone else could say anything, and he spoke in a tone that implied the discussion was at an end. I'll lead it, and I'd like to take 110 with me. 110 sat up straighter in his chair. Me? You're still our computer expert. Well, 110, 111, and I were the S.C.E's computer experts. By yourself, Sonia interrupted. You've still got the computer efficiency rating of 10. That's your rating, not yours and 111's. She also had a 10, but the point is, the best person in Starfleet has an 8. I do not believe that you will be satisfied with my diminished performance. You should select someone else. That won't be necessary, Sonia said. You're the right person for this job, 110. Unless you're refusing a direct order, you're on the team. Sonia's strategy was risky. After all, 110 was a civilian. But he and 111 had agreed to be under Starfleet orders for the duration of their time on the Da Vinci, and until they actually reported to Starbase 505, that agreement was still technically in place. The Binar took a look at Bart for some reason, then seemed to relax. I would not presume to go against the commander's judgment. I will accompany you on the mission. Good, the captain said. Good, the captain said. Meantime, I want the rest of you to read up on Eerlik. It's possible they'll need more help from us beyond fixing Ganitriul, and I want to be ready. Sonia looked at the security chief. Commander Corsi, I'll leave the size and personnel of the security detail to your discretion. Yes, sir, Corsi said. Good, the captain said again. Oh, and I have one other bit of news. Sonia leaned forward. I'm going to be a great-grandfather again. Several congratulatory noises went around the table. Shaking her head, Sonia got up, finished off her tea, and put the mug back in the replicator to be recycled. Some of the crew stuck around to hear the captain tell of his granddaughter's pregnancy, but Sonia wanted to get started on the day's work. She and Geordi walked out together. Nice job, Geordi said. I'm sorry that this will delay you getting back to the Enterprise, Gomez said. Geordi shrugged. I'll live. Danilova should be able to muddle through without me a little while longer. Danilova? Sonia said, her eyes going wide. You mean Raisa Danilova? She's your assistant chief now? Laughing that staccato laugh of his, Geordi said, She made lieutenant last year, and I made her assistant chief after the Dominion War ended. But she was the slowest person in that whole engine room, Sonia said, returning the laugh. She'd spend all day on a sensor recalibration. She picked up some speed after you left. Actually, what mostly got her going was the war. I always kept her out of emergency situations because of her lack of speed, but I didn't have that luxury when we were being pounded by the Jem'Hadar. And something about having engineering falling apart around her lit a fire under her or something. She blossomed into one of my best people. Sonia shook her head. Pretty amazing. They arrived at Sonia's quarters, where she was planning to set out a game plan for the mission. In any case, Geordi said, I think the Enterprise is in safe hands. Besides, this mission sounds like it might be interesting. Sonia tensed. After relaxing around Geordi for the first time since they had picked him up at Blossom 4 last week, Sonia found herself back on eggshells again. Geordi obviously noticed this. If nothing else, his ocular implants allowed him to notice biological shifts that normal vision couldn't detect, and said quickly, Hey, don't worry. I'm not trying to horn in on you or anything. I know, it's just, this is my team, not yours. Nodding, Geordi said, Don't worry, Sonia. I know this is your show. He added with a smile, For what it's worth, I think you're doing a great job. Letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, Sonia said, Thanks. Coming from you, that means a lot. I'll talk to you later, okay? Sonia nodded in reply and entered her quarters. Chapter 4. 5 of the speakers had managed to assemble in Valandru Hall. Ansed was impressed with their fortitude. 3 of them, including Ansed herself, lived in the capital city. The other 2 happened to be in Valandru Hall, working. Another speaker lived in the capital city, but he was not present. He had sent his son with the message that he'd broken his leg tripping over his furniture when the lights went out. Rather than take their usual seats, which were spread around the large table intended to seat all 31 speakers, the 5 of them bunched up at one end of the table, around the head, where Ansed traditionally sat. Also present in the hall was a heavily bandaged Undlar, who sat to Ansed's right. He was no longer shaking, but Ansed thought the young man still seemed a bit out of it. The first order of business was to discuss how the enforcement was dealing with the crisis, and also the investigation into the murder of the priests. Both were proceeding as well as could be expected. A clever enforcement officer had found some old radios, and they'd been issued allowing communication. A top investigator had been assigned to the slaughter. After that, they turned to the issue of Ganitriul. I have just come from the transportation center, said Speaker Birrell. They've been doing tests with inanimate objects. Every attempt has failed, and it's a different failure every time, too. Sometimes the object goes to the wrong place, sometimes it's inside out, sometimes it never rematerializes, sometimes the console goes down. So the point is, Ansed put in, Birrell had a tendency to babble, that transporting to the moon is not an option. Speaker Miko said, We can't risk taking a ship either, even if some of them do work now. What if they fail en route? And who do we send? Asked Speaker Torin. Rhaegar Undlar here isn't no shape to travel. I can make the journey, Undlar said quietly, and I believe there is also a way to get me there. Ansed whirled in surprise. There is? I believe so. Miko said angrily, Why didn't you mention this before? I'm sorry, Undlar said, in the sardonic tone Ansed had noticed earlier returned, but I've been a bit preoccupied with the brutal murder of my brothers. Softening, Miko said, Of course, I'm sorry, Rhaegar. These are troubling times, and I forget myself. That is all right, Speaker, Undlar said, his voice getting more subdued again. It's just that there is a Pevni trading ship in Brioni port that might be able to make the journey. It is an experimental ship that has circuitry independent of the Great One. Ansed's already wide eyes went wider. What? Shock spread around the table as the other 4 speakers expressed similar outrage. Who approved this? Birrell asked. Undlar straightened. We did. The Pevni came to the clergy with a special request to construct this prototype. They built it as an experiment in case further dealings with the Federation led to more out-of-system travel beyond the Great One's ability to control. Angry once again, Miko said, That should never have been approved without consulting the speakers. I don't see how that matters, Undlar said in dignity. We are the caretakers of the Great One, and so the Pevni wisely came to us to gain approval for this prototype. We thought it was a worthwhile experiment for precisely the reasons they gave. And you didn't think to consult us? Birrell asked, his face turning indigo with outrage. Rhaegar, Ansed said calmly, trying to keep this from turning into a shouting match. Perhaps you didn't realize the political implications of what you were doing. What political implications? Undlar asked, now looking confused. Ansed sighed. Priests are wonderful for spiritual matters, but they can be shockingly naive. One of the reasons why we have remained so stable over the millennia is because we are united under Ganitriul. We have had no war, no upheavals, and no strife for 3,000 years. The Pevni colonization could safely be called an upheaval. Save me from youth, Ansed thought, trying not to groan. Undlar hadn't been born when the ninth planet had been colonized by the Pevni. Not at all. It was an orderly process that was debated around this very table and voted on by the people. Eventually, the Pevni were granted permission, but the process by which they got there was orderly. To secretly grant the Pevni the right to construct vessels independent of the system is not orderly. It was never meant to be secret, Undlar said defensively. We simply did not see it as a concern. Well, you should have, Ansed said, trying and failing not to sound condescending. There are those among the Pevni who have expressed an interest in breaking off from Eerlik and from Ganitriul. This is exactly the kind of thing they might use as a weapon against us. Before Undlar could respond to that, Speaker Tolu said, First Speaker, with all due respect, is this really the time to reprimand Rhaegar Undlar for information that may well save us? Ansed was brought up short by Tolu's statement, which was delivered in the older woman's usual measured tones. But then she thought, Tolu has always been the voice of reason among the speakers. You're right, of course, Tolu. If this ship does have circuitry that is independent of Ganitriul, then we must see if we can use it to fly to the moon immediately. If no one objects, we should adjourn to Brioni and see if this ship... The Senbalma, Undlar said. Ansed nodded. If the Senbalma is truly spaceworthy. I'm not going out there, Birol said. It's insane. And just walking from my home left me dehydrated. You're not getting me to Brioni. That's at least a couple hours' walk. Every other speaker chimed in with similar responses. Even Tolu, from whom Ansed had expected more, though she was quite elderly. Truth be told, Ansed felt the same way in her heart, but she had a duty to perform, and she would not shirk it, even if the others would. Then I will go myself, she said, getting to her feet. As will I, said Undlar, doing the same, albeit somewhat less steadily. That is unnecessary, Ansed said, not relishing the idea of supporting the wounded priest throughout the walk. It would be a waste, Rhaegar, especially if it turns out that the Senbalma is not spaceworthy. She put an encouraging hand on his shoulder, hoping he would forgive her earlier patronizing tone. I will send for you if and when it proves to be the case. We will, after all, need your guidance to fix Ganitriul. Undlar looked like he was about to argue, but then he cut himself off. Of course, First Speaker, I will await word from you. Excellent. You should hear from me soon. And if, she thought, no, when this is all over, Rhaegar Undlar, we will have a long talk on the subject of appropriate behavior for the clergy. Undlar was the last of the priests left, and whatever new ones were ordained after this would look up to him as their leader, for better or for worse. Which meant that this naivete would have to be dealt with, and quickly. But first things first, Ansed thought, steeling herself against the ordeal of another endless hike, and heading once more into the cold. Sonia Gomez took one last look over the schematics that presently occupied the display of her tricorder. Thankfully, the Eerlik had several years back, allowed a team of Federation computer experts, including a group of 8 binars, to inspect Ganitriul, so Starfleet had detailed specs on the installation. Which was, in a word, huge! Fully 25% of Eerlik's moon had been excavated in order to house the computer. In fact, most of that equipment had fallen into disuse, as, typically with advancing technology, the Eerlik were able to miniaturize over time. Only about 10% of the original installation was still active, though the auto-repair components included small robots that could cannibalize the older equipment as need be. All in all, a very efficient system. She looked up to see that 110 still hadn't arrived yet. She stood in the transporter room with Corsi and 2 other security people, Drew and Hawkins. Sonia had thought that 3 security people was a bit excessive to guard a 2-person team, but she trusted Corsi's judgment. Where the hell is he? Corsi said after inspecting her phaser rifle for the 40th time. He'll be here. Cut him in a little slack, Commander. He's been through a lot. With respect, sir, if he's too wrecked to even show up for a mission on time, then I have to question whether or not he can perform the mission. And it's a valid question, but I'd like to give him at least a chance to answer it. Corsi let out a breath. Yes, sir. Just then, the doors parted and 110 entered, walking even faster than normal. My apologies, Commander Gomez. I can offer no excuse. I don't expect you to, Sonia said gently. Let's go. As she moved to step onto the platform, the doors opened once again, and Carol Abramowitz entered. Yes? Sonia asked. Commander, I just wanted to let you know that speed is of the essence here. I've been reading up on the Eerlik, and they have two major facets as a culture. They are fanatical about maintaining order, and they pride themselves on being well informed. Both of these stem from Ganitriul. So it's very likely the conditions on Eerlik are deteriorating and are going to get worse the more time passes. Don't dawdle down there. Sonia smiled. Wasn't planning on it anyhow, but I appreciate the report. Thanks, Carol. No problem. The five of them arranged themselves on the transporter pad. To the transporter chief, Sonia said, "Energize." They materialized into pitch darkness. Oh, great, Sonia thought. She switched on her wrist lamp, and the others did the same. Now the space they were in, which felt cold and stuffy, was illuminated by 5 light sources that cast odd shadows. Unfortunately, this did nothing but make it bright, cold, and stuffy. Drew played his light over one of the walls. "Rocks!" he deadpanned. "Hello," said a voice that seemed to come from everywhere. "Are you from Starfleet?" The voice was very pleasant. Sonia couldn't place it gender-wise, but it set her at ease immediately. "Yes," she said. "I'm Commander Sonia Gomez of the Starfleet Corps of Engineers." "Excellent. I am glad you replied to my call. I am Ganitriul. Welcome." "Thank you. And who are the others? I am registering 5 life forms?" Indicating the Binar, though having no idea if Ganitriul could see the gesture, Sonia said, "This is 110, who is part of my engineering team. The others are Lieutenant Commander Domenica Corsi and 2 of her security team, Stephen Drew and Vance Hawkins." "I welcome all of you. I apologize for the darkness, but I cannot seem to get the lights working." "That's all right." She consulted her tricorder, which glowed brightly in the near darkness. It showed that the main terminal was only a few meters away. "If you don't mind, we'll go to your main terminal and try to determine what's wrong." She started walking in the right direction, 110 on her heels, the security detail behind them. "I hope you can, Commander Gomez. I'm afraid that my own attempts to diagnose the problem have failed. I do not understand why I've been unable to function properly. I should also warn you that there are several security devices that are meant to prevent anyone from tampering with the system. My control over them is sporadic. Please be careful." The voice was almost pleading. Or maybe Sonia was projecting. Either way, she resolved to watch her step, and was suddenly grateful that Corsi had taken a team of 3. Corsi said, "Ganitriul, which security protocols don't you have control over right now?" "I'm afraid it varies. Are you familiar with my security specifications?" "Yes." "At the moment, I have complete control over everything in the immediate vicinity. If that changes, or if you move into an area that I do not have control over, I will inform you." "Thank you." Within moments, they turned a corner, and the walls were replaced by what appeared to be a giant, smooth slab of black marble. Corsi, Drew, and Hawkins also shone their wrist lamp on it, giving Sonia a better view. The slab, she suspected, was a large view screen. In front of it, she could see a very comfortable-looking chair, which was also distressingly close to the ground. Various buttons dotted the wide arms of the chair. "All right, I give up. What is it?" Corsi asked. "The main terminal," Sonia said. She pointed at the slab. "That's the view screen. The operator sits in the chair and operates it with those buttons." Hawkins looked dubiously at the chair. "They sit in that?" "The Eerlik are fairly short," Sonia said, "with small legs for their height, generally, so this is the right size for them. And the view screen can afford to be this large. They have wide eyes and a breadth of vision that is much greater than we do." As if on cue, the view screen lit up with several images. Some were views of parts of a city being subjected to bad weather. Sonia assumed it was a city on Eerlik. Others showed bits of data in a language Sonia recognized as Makaro, the most common language on Eerlik. She couldn't read a word of it, of course, but she had seen similar writing in the mission profile. In addition, a small hole that looked like some kind of data port opened in the smooth surface. Sonia could detect no seams. It was as if the hole just appeared, though that could have just been a function of the dim light. "I must warn you not to sit in the chair," Ganitriul said suddenly. "The chair is designed to allow only those whose DNA patterns match those of the presently ordained clergy to sit in it. I have been unable to disable that function." "That's bad, isn't it?" Drew said. "There is an alternative. 110, you are a member of the Binar race, are you not?" "Yes, I am," 110 said. "In that case, you may interface directly with my data port." 110 hesitated. "Very well." He moved toward the data port. As he did, Corsi, who had been gazing at her tricorder, cried, "Wait!" "What is it, Lieutenant Commander?" "I'm reading a ton of electricity flowing through that port." "That is normal," Ganitriul said. "I really don't think that 110 can handle it." "Binar epidermis is able to conduct electrical charges, Lieutenant Commander," 110 said. "Not this much. We're talking 80,000 kilojoules." "That is not what my readings indicate. Please wait a moment." A pause, then Ganitriul continued. "My apologies. It appears my readings were incorrect. Lieutenant Commander Corsi, please tell me what you are reading now." Corsi looked at her tricorder. 200 kilojoules. That's within 110's tolerances. Nodding, 110 said, "Yes, it is." 110 placed a small hand inside the data port, which altered its size to accommodate the size and shape of the binar's hand. A nimbus of electricity started to form around 110, further illuminating the chamber. Then the binar let out a rapid-fire burst in the binary language of his people, which the universal translator simply rendered as a high-pitched whine. Bart had said, when Sonia first arrived on the Da Vinci, that the translators could be modified to understand the binar tongue, but Sonia had never seen the need. Now she was sorry she hadn't taken him up on it. While this went on, Drew said, "Sir, I've got some weird readings here." Define weird, Drew. I'm getting occasional lifeform readings, but then they just disappear. The tricorder thinks they're Eerlik. My apologies, Ganitriul said. Those are sensa ghosts. That is part of the tour that is given to visitors to these caverns. I provide a recreation of the excavation of the moon, and it includes representations of the workers. The simulation includes sensor readings of the workers. I will attempt to prevent that program from running, but I can make no assurances that I will be successful. Do the best you can, Ganitriul, Sonia said, trying to sound understanding. So Corsi walked up to her and said in a low tone that only Sonia could hear, "It's a computer, Commander, not a kid with a toy." Matching the security chief's tone, Sonia said, "It's an intelligent computer. I think treating it with respect is perfectly reasonable." Shrugging, Corsi said, "I guess." Sonia noticed the light in the cavern growing dimmer. She turned to see that 110 had removed his hand from the data port. "I have found the problem," he said as the glow faded from around him. "An invasive program has been introduced into Ganitriul's system." "Sabotage," Corsi said. "Yes, Lieutenant Commander." "I do not doubt your diagnosis, 110, but I do not understand how it came to be. I have no record of any invasive programs being inserted into my system." "Once we have fixed the problem, I can show you how it was done, Ganitriul." "Can the program be safely removed?" Sonia asked. "It is possible, yes. We will need..." Sonia did not learn what 110 would need, as he was interrupted by some kind of blaster fire, which struck Hawkins in the left shoulder. The security guard cried out in pain and fell to the cavern ground, grabbing his left shoulder with his right hand and dropping his phaser rifle. As Corsi raised her own rifle to return fire, Ganitriul said, "A security measure has been activated. No energy weapons will fire within the confines of the installation." Corsi pressed the firing button on her rifle anyhow, but nothing happened. "Damn it!" she muttered. It was then that the lights came back up. Sonia blinked the spots out of her eyes and found herself surrounded by 12 Eerlik. Some of them were also blinking with upper and lower eyelids in response to the greater illumination. Some were holstering their blasters and unholstering large, curved, bladed weapons. "Death to the aliens!" one of them cried. Several more repeated, "Death to the aliens!" Then they charged. Chapter 5. Ansed held her breath as the Senbalma left the atmosphere of Eerlik. So far, she thought, so good. The owner of the Senbalma was an old man named Emaurer, who expressed a certain reluctance to test his ship in quite this manner. He had been hoping to remain in dock until the crisis passed. However, he could not turn down a specific request from the First Speaker and the last remaining priest, especially since they were willing to share the risk with him by taking the flight. Besides, the Senbalma going to the moon was likely the only way the crisis would pass. The ship's pilot said, "We've cleared the stratosphere, now entering orbit of Eerlik. We'll have our window to the moon in 15 minutes. All systems reading nominal." He sounded almost surprised. "Good," Emaurer said from the seat to the pilot's right. The flight deck of the Senbalma was small, with only 2 chairs at one large console. Ansed stood behind Emaurer, looking at the amazing vista on the view screen in front of her. She had seen pictures of what Eerlik looked like from orbit, but nothing could have prepared her for the experience. No picture had adequately conveyed the deep burgundy of the oceans, the swirling, majestic patterns of the clouds, or the deep brown of the landmasses. As they orbited, she saw the Langkap mountain range just outside the capital city. After a minute, they flew over the teardrop-shaped form of Marylo Island, where she had been born. Then came the ragged, beautiful Kai Pass coast, where she'd spent so many summers as a girl. It took her breath away. To see the landmarks of her life this way was staggering. Unlar was in the small cabin he and Ansed were sharing. Space was at a premium on the Senbalma, meditating. Ansed was half tempted to run down, grab him, and force him to look at this view. She certainly was determined, now more than ever, to do whatever she could to save her world. Emaurer turned around to look at Ansed. "Nice view, huh?" "Yes, it is." "Never been up here before, have you, First Speaker?" "No, I haven't." She smiled. "It's funny. I always used to dismiss people who took trips to the moon to tour Ganitriul as silly tourists. Now I'm sorry I never did take one of those trips. It would have been worth it just to see this. I had no idea that the oceans were so burgundy in the mountains. Her voice trailed off. I never get tired of it either. Although, personally, I think the view is better back home, Imara said, returning to the Pevney colony. He turned back to his console and entered some commands into it. Compensate for that, will you? He said to the pilot, then turned back to Ansed. I have to say, it's weird flying without a net like this. Still, it's kind of thrilling, too. Thrilling? Ansed asked, surprised. Oh, sure. Not knowing every possible variable, being surprised by a random meteor or another ship in the same orbit. That doesn't happen with Ganitriul controlling everything. Never any worries about that. Makes you get lazy. What you call lazy, sir, I call safe. I see no benefit in taking unnecessary risks. With a wide, infectious grin, Imara said, well, First Speaker, I guess that's why I own a spaceship and you're a politician. Ansed couldn't help but return the grin. Imara was right, of course. His reaction made perfect sense for one in his position. Ansed herself had never understood the urge that drove the Pevney to colonize in the first place, but that didn't mean she would demean it. And it was perfectly possible to thrive without Ganitriul. All the major powers of the Alpha Quadrant did just fine without one central computer. In fact, indeed, Ansed wondered if one computer could administer something as large as the Federation. Enough, she admonished herself. Let us first see if one computer will ever administer Eerlik again before we wax philosophical. Approaching the window now, the pilot said. This is interesting. I'm reading a ship in orbit around the moon. It's too far away for a positive identification. Another ship? Ansed asked. That could be the answer. Whoever is on that ship could have sabotaged Ganitriul. That would certainly explain everything. Imara said. Get ready to head for the moon, he said to the pilot. Imara initially kept the view screen on the view of Eerlik even as they headed toward the moon. The planet receded as they got farther away. Within a few minutes, however, he switched the view to that moon and to the ship in orbit around it. That's a Starfleet ship, the pilot said. Registry NCC 81623, U.S.S. DaVinci Sabre class. Which one is Sabre class? The pilot shrugged. Don't know, we don't have a database, remember? I just got this from the scan. It doesn't make any sense, Ansed said. Why would Starfleet sabotage Ganitriul? Well, we could ask them, Imara said. He touched a few buttons on his console and a small whistling noise emitted from it. This is the Senbalma on behalf of the government of Eerlik, contacting the U.S.S. DaVinci. Please state your business. After a moment, the face of an older human male appeared on the screen. Like most of his race, he had tufts of fuzz on top of his head, though this one's was white and wispy. This is Captain David Gold of the DaVinci. We're here in response to a distress call from Ganitriul. Ansed blinked. From Ganitriul? She cleared her throat. Captain, I am First Speaker Ansed. A pleasure, First Speaker. If you don't mind my asking, how did you get up here? I was led to believe that none of the Eerlik ships worked. With all due respect, Captain, I would ask that you leave orbit. This is an Eerlik matter, not a Starfleet one. Ansed did not want to give Gold any information. If they were responsible for the sabotage, telling them that this was the only working ship, and that they carried the last remaining priest, would be tantamount to suicide. She had no idea what kind of armament the ship carried, but the Federation was less than a year out of a nasty, prolonged war. While Eerlik had managed to avoid becoming embroiled in the Dominion War, they had heard quite a bit about it. Ansed doubted that any Starfleet ship was anything but fully armed. I already have a team from the Starfleet Corps of Engineers in the cavern working on the problem, First Speaker. If you want us to pull out, that's fine, but my people are the best. Let them do their work. Ansed was torn. Starfleet's reputation was generally good, but with everything else that was happening, she didn't know who to trust. Another voice sounded on the speakers, and it was one Ansed was grateful to hear. First Speaker, this is Ganitriul. The DaVinci is here at my request. Their team just transported down, and they will arrive at one of my primary terminals in 2 minutes. Please, allow... Then the signal cut off. Imara made some adjustments to his console. I can't get the signal back, but it did seem to come from the moon. Ansed let out a long breath. My apologies, Captain. When we first saw your ship... Say no more, First Speaker, Gold said, holding up a hand. Can't say as I blame you, really. I have one of the clergy on board. I believe that his help will be invaluable in aiding your team. Couldn't hurt. Ansed heard the door open behind her. She turned to see Undlar enter. Here he is now, she said to Gold. Rhaegar Undlar, this is Captain David Gold from Starfleet. It turns out that Ganitriul asked the Federation for help. Yes, well, we were afraid of something like this. Now, Imar, Undlar said as he unsheathed a knife from under his robes and stabbed Ansed in the chest. As Ansed collapsed to the deck, blue blood spilling from her punctured heart, she cried out in an anguished, Why? Undlar smiled a vicious smile. You'll never know. Then her vision went blank. To be continued next week. Thank you very much for watching. You can find me online at DeCandido.net. at DeCandido.wordpress.com. And if you could please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/KRAD, that would be awesome. Thank you very much. I'll see you next week, and please stay safe.